Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Charlene and today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of June. So the number of books I read is going to look a bit skewed because I read 11 books in June, but a lot of them were very, very short books. I think I only read 2 or 3 actual novel-length books. I read 7 that were graphic novel or picture books, and then 1 book of poetry. I think that counts all of it. June was just an off reading month for me. As I mentioned in my July TBR video, we went on vacation the first week of June. And the second week of June, it was getting stuff taken care of from vacation, getting all the laundry done, and so on. And getting things caught up for this channel, getting back into our routine, all of that. And I think part of me was not thrilled with the fact that I wasn't finishing a lot of books. And so I started picking up a few graphic novels. And then I also ended up deciding to sign up for NetGalley and try to get some reviews in there. And the easiest way to do that is to pick graphic novels and things of that sort so I can read them quicker and start getting reviews in. Because part of the thing with that site is having reviews, having a review history can help you get approved for more books in the future. So I at least wanted to get that started, get the ball rolling on that. But I think part of me was also looking for the feeling of actually finishing a book. And yeah, so I ended up reading a lot of short stuff. I did not finish a lot of the books that were on my TBR for June. I think I only finished 2 books. So if that doesn't tell you how skewed my reading was, I don't know what does. But the first books I'm going to talk about are the ones that I read for Chantel's Read Your Bookshelf Challenge that she's hosting this year. And the way this challenge works this year is she has 2 different paths. She has an Ellen Montgomery side and a Sir Arthur Conan Doyle side. And they each have their own prompts. And then in the months of April, July, and I believe October, they converge. And I'm not specifically trying to read a book that fits the prompts in the month that it's assigned. My only criteria is that I'm trying to complete both sides. I should probably start with that. I'm trying to complete both sides at once. But I want to complete 1 full month before I move on to the next month. So I would have to complete both of June's prompts before I could try to complete the July prompt. So I ended up reading 3 books in the month of June that qualify for the Read Your Bookshelf Challenge. I got both of June's done and I got July's done. So I don't have to worry about July's next month. It will not be in the July wrap up. But like I said, I was kind of just trying to get through some books, and if they qualified for the challenge, they qualified for the challenge. So the first book I read for this challenge was for the Ellen Montgomery side, and that was to read a book of poetry. And the book I read was Evangeline and Selected Tales and Poems by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I know I've read a few of his poems when I was in school. I'm sure at some point I read Paul Revere's Ride. And I know I read the poem The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls, because my high school choir actually did a choral arrangement of that poem, which I loved. It's such a gorgeous song. If I can find a version of that song, I will link it down in the description below. But I absolutely loved it. It was one of my favorite songs that our choir did. I did not sing in the choir, by the way, before any of you think that I sing. I do not in public. I will sing with the radio, but I do not sing in public. I was actually the accompanist in our choir. I really liked that song, and then I found out it was originally based on a poem, so I read the poem, which is essentially all of the lines in the song, but I still went ahead and read it. Beyond that, I'm not sure which of his poems I had read before. None of the poems in here were familiar to me, except for Paul Revere's Ride. But I don't know if I actually read Paul Revere's Ride before, or if it's just that I've heard of it. Everything else in here was brand new to me, but I really liked this collection of poems. I will also double check and make sure that I'm correct on this, but I do believe he is also the one who wrote the Christmas Carol, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. I will check and verify that, and I will put it at the bottom of the screen if I was right or not, but I believe he's the one who wrote that song. So I've been interested in his poetry and just never picked any up until I got this book, which, slight spoiler for my upcoming book haul. The poem Evangeline was definitely one of my favorites in here, but it's also one of the longest. And while I like poetry in general, I do tend to like the more narrative poems, the ones that are longer, that actually tell a story. So I'm not surprised that that was one of my favorites. I'm not even sure what else to really talk about with this book, would I recommend it or not. Poetry is one of those things, sometimes you find somebody you like, sometimes you don't. I really like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and the style of poetry that he does, but I know that might not be for everybody. So I would recommend go ahead and look up Paul Revere's Ride and The Tide Rises, The Tide Falls. They're both fairly short, and if you like those poems by him, you might enjoy more by him. And I will leave a link to those two poems down in the description below in case you want to check them out. So like I said, I ended up really enjoying his poetry. If you've liked some of his other poems, I would recommend checking them out. But again, I know it's not necessarily going to be for everyone. And then the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle side was to read a science fiction or fantasy book. And for that, I ended up reading The Glasstown Game by Catherine M. Valenti. This is one of the two books on my TBR that I actually finished. But this is also a book that it's a middle grade fantasy, and it's about the Bronte siblings. In real life, the Bronte siblings created this world called Glasstown. And they had 10 soldiers that they played with. They made up stories for them. They created battles for them. And in this book, they end up discovering that Glasstown is real. They end up traveling there. There are things about it that are not the same as what they came up with, but a lot of the same characters are there. A lot of the same places are there. Some of the events that they came up with have happened, and so on. And I ended up really enjoying this book. It's not a new all-time favorite, unfortunately, but it's also one I think I would have enjoyed more if I had read it as a child. This book has a lot of play on words and puns, so puns are not necessarily my thing. I kind of enjoyed some of the play on words, like the term champagne flutes was one that was used. It's used early on, and basically the kids get these glass flutes, literal flutes, musical flutes, and they play into them, and they get the sensation of tasting champagne without actually drinking it. So there were a lot of those types of play on words, twisting, well, I shouldn't say twisting the meaning, taking the meaning of things very literally. And that part I think I would have enjoyed more when I was a kid than I do as an adult. However, one of the things I really liked that was explored in this book, because I thought about this when I was reading about the Brontes, but it's the sibling dynamics. Because in the Bronte household, Charlotte was actually the third oldest. She had Branwell, Emily, and Anne who came after her, but then she had, I think it was Marie and Elizabeth were before her. But their two oldest sisters ended up dying from, I don't remember now. I want to say it was tuberculosis, but I don't remember for sure. But they caught something while they were away at boarding school, and they ended up dying from it. So Charlotte went from being the third oldest to being the oldest very quickly. And I always wondered how that affected the sibling dynamics and how that affected Charlotte. And that's explored a lot in this book, where Charlotte is at times thinking about, I'm now the oldest, so this is my job, this is what I need to do. And you also have Branwell, who's the only boy in the family, who he wants to be the man of the family. He wants to be the leader, even though he's not the oldest. So I feel like they're both really trying to figure out where they fit in the family and what their role is, now that their two oldest siblings are gone, and in the case of Branwell, also the fact that he's getting older and he's going to be the man of the family after their father. That was a dynamic of the story I really enjoyed and really appreciated that was put in here. The story itself was a lot of fun, and I will say it's not predictable. there was never a point in this story where I felt like I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew exactly how things were going to play out and how the story was going to wrap up. That never happened. And I appreciate that a lot. I don't like when stories are super predictable, and this one definitely wasn't. So if you have an interest in the Brontes, I would recommend at least giving it a try. I know some other people have not enjoyed it, but you never know. So then, because I completed those 2 prompts, I went ahead and picked up a book that fulfilled the prompt for July. And like I said, in July, the 2 paths converge for the bookshelf reading challenge. So there's only 1 prompt, and I'm only reading 1 book. I'm not reading 2 because there's 2 different sides of this. So the prompt for July was to read a short story collection. And for this one, I ended up reading a graphic novel of short stories, and that was Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Lost Adventures, and Team Avatar Tales. Technically, these are 2 different volumes, but where I found them on Hoopla, they were actually combined into 1 volume, so I just read both of them. And this one is a collection of short stories that take place during the time of the TV show, but they're things that we didn't see in the show. So they may reference things that happened recently to them in the timeline of the show, or they might be side things that were happening. This was happening over here in the show that we saw, but this was actually happening over here at the same time. Things along that line. There are a variety of writers and artists who contributed to this book. And so you get a lot of different art styles. You get a lot of different story styles. Some of the stories are longer. They're 10 to 15 pages long. Some of them are only 2 or 3 pages long. So there's a good variety in the book. And there were definitely some that I enjoyed more than others. Again, like the poetry, I tended to like the longer stories better. But overall, I thought it was a good book. And I kind of forgot to do this for the earlier books, so I'll just add it in now. Typically in my wrap-ups, I'm giving you a list of the content that's in the book. This is based on what you would get from a movie or video game rating. So language content, drug and alcohol, sexual content, violence, and potentially themes, if it doesn't fit into one of the other 4 categories. And again, as I said in my May wrap-up, I'm not saying you should or should not read the book because of the content that's in it. I'm just letting you know what content is there, so you can decide if this is a book that you want to read or not. So for Evangeline, I'm going to have to read these off my phone, I'm sorry. But language, there wasn't any that I recall. Drug and alcohol, I think there might have been a poem or 2 that mentioned beer, but I can't say I remember for sure. Sexual content, there wasn't any. And violence, there is some. We do have poems about battles or skirmishes between a couple people. So there is some violence there. There are some deaths that happen in the book. Not necessarily violent ones. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. But those are the main things I could think of that were actually in the poems in this book. And then for the Glasstown game, there is no language. Drug and alcohol content, there is some mentions of alcohol, like I mentioned, the champagne flutes. There are mentions of alcoholic things being drunk every once in a while, or consumed in some way, I guess, because champagne flutes do not work like our champagne flutes. Sexual content, there wasn't any. Violence, there is quite a bit. We're in Glasstown, where this is a reimagining of the battle between France and England during the Napoleonic Wars. So there's a lot of battles going on. So there is quite a bit of violence. But for the most part, it's not graphically described. A couple times it is a little more so. And it's not overly gory, though there is one part somewhat early on in the book where the blood is described more so. But the rest of the book, it's usually not graphically described. There might be one description here or there that is, but for the most part, it's not too graphic. And then for Avatar: The Last Airbender, language, there's none. Drug and alcohol content, there's none. Sexual content, there's none. And violence, again, there is a fair amount. We're dealing with a time where the 4 nations, or I should say the 3 nations, were not getting along. So there are a lot of fights and skirmishes between the different nations, and it involves weapons, it involves bending, so water, air, earth, fire bending. So there is a fair amount in there, but again, blood and gore wise, it's very minimal. And then from there, I decided to go ahead and continue on with the prequel books from Avatar: The Last Airbender and just get all 3 of them done. I was originally hoping to be done with this series this year, but some of the other graphic novels got added to the series, so that didn't happen. And my original plan was to go ahead and still try to finish the series, but I discovered that another book is coming out this year, and so I have no idea if the series is actually going to be done after that book or if they're still going to put out more books. So I did read the prequels, but at this point I've changed my mind. I'm not going to go ahead and continue on with the series. I may pick it up later because there are other series that I'm wanting to finish, and I'm not going to get to them if I'm focusing on a series that's not yet finished. So the next volume I picked up was Katara and the Pirate's Silver, and this one, I'm pretty sure all of these actually take place during the time of the TV show. I said in my July TBR video that they might have taken place between the TV show and the first graphic novel called The Promise, but I don't think that's actually the case. So in Katara and the Pirate's Silver, Katara gets separated from the rest of the group and has to navigate her way through part of the Earth Kingdom that's being run by the Fire Nation and falls in with a band of pirates. We'll just leave it at that. Overall, I liked the story. After reading a whole bunch of the short stories in the previous volume, it was nice to get a full story again, even if this one is only 80 pages, because a lot of the others, like The Promise and The Search, are over 200 pages. But it was nice to get a little bit longer story. So content-wise, again, no language, no drug and alcohol, and no sexual content. But violence, again, there is some. Mostly with bending, but also some with weapons like catapults and cannons. And then the last one that I read was Suki Alone, which follows Suki, who's the leader of the Kyoshi Warriors in the TV show. And she is captured by the Fire Nation and imprisoned by them. But she wants to try to figure out a way to escape. And so the story follows her attempt to help the other prisoners and then also work with them to try to turn against the Fire Nation and try to break out of the prison. So content for this one, language-wise, there's none. Drug and alcohol, there's none. Sexual content, there's no actual sexual content, but I know some people will want to know this one way or another. There is a girl who tells Suki that she has a girlfriend. And violence-wise, again, there's fighting without weapons. Suki is more of a martial artist. So there is fighting, but there's no weapons, no bending, and no blood or gore. And I don't think I specified with any of the books, but this is categorized as a middle grade series. So just something to keep in mind as you look at the content, not just whether you might want to read these, but whether you might want your kids to read these. That's part of the reason I do this content, is because, especially when it comes to middle grade and YA, some people might want to know if this is appropriate for their kid or not. So with Glasstown Game being middle grade, with this being middle grade, you can look at that content and decide if you're okay with reading it yourself or with your child reading it. All right, then there were 2 other novels that I read, and then we'll get into the NetGalley books. So the first one that I finished, I started this, I want to say in February or March, but I don't remember for sure. But it's Tactics by Greg Koukl. And this is a Christian nonfiction book. And how to describe this one. So this is a book about how to talk to people who either have different views from you or who try to attack your views as a Christian. And it's just a way of asking people questions, getting them to really think about what they believe and why they believe it, and potentially through those questions, get them to see your viewpoint versus their viewpoint. I did really enjoy the book. However, my personal recommendation for this would be to read a chapter and then take a day or 2 off, or read 2 or 3 chapters and take a day or 2 off, because the content in this book can feel a little bit repetitive. There are different tactics covered in every chapter, but it's the kind of the formula of We're going to talk about the tactic and what it means, how it works. I'm going to give you examples. Yeah, that part can feel a little repetitive. And after a few days, I was feeling very bogged down by the amount of information and also trying to read the chapters when they feel very similar to each other. So I would recommend taking a little bit of a break, at least every few chapters, but that's my personal recommendation. And content-wise, it probably comes as no surprise. There's none. There's no language, there's no drug and alcohol, there's no sexual content, and there's no violence. And then the only other novel I finished this month was The Dead Man in the Garden by Martha Jocelyn, which is the third book in the Aggie Morton Mystery Queen series. And I've really been enjoying this series. This is a middle grade mystery series, and Aggie is basically a fictionalized version of Agatha Christie as a child. We have a character named Hector Perot, who is kind of her version of Hercule Poirot as a child. She says that Hector is more supposed to be the person who was Agatha Christie's inspiration for Hercule Poirot, but I still just call him Hercule Poirot as a child. And then her Granny Jane is basically Miss Marple. And in this book, Aggie, her mother, her grandmother, and Hector all go to a hotel and spa in Yorkshire. I don't remember now how long ago it was, but Aggie's father passed away, and her mother has been in grieving for quite a while. And so the family goes to this spa so that her mother can get some relaxation, get some, soothing treatments, and hopefully start getting back to herself. But when the family arrives, they very soon learn that a former patient recently passed away under mysterious circumstances, and then a few days after they arrive, another dead body shows up. So, Aggie and Hector begin investigating to see if they can figure out what happened. I will say one thing I appreciate in this series is that the police are never portrayed as being kind of these bumbling idiots. They are very competent. They very much do their job. It's just that sometimes Aggie and Hector come across bits of information that help with the investigation, but it's not like without their help, the police wouldn't have solved it, just more so they might help it get solved faster. And I will be honest, I had no clue in this book who it was that was behind any of the crimes that were going on. I was trying to figure it out. I had a long list of suspects just like Aggie and Hector, and I had no clue. I do like it when I get to the end of a mystery book and I haven't figured it out, but once you have all of the information, it all makes sense. And that's pretty much what this book was. So content-wise for this book, language, there's none. Drugs and alcohol, there are some mentions of champagne. There might be mentions of wine. There is one mention of sherry when the kids are specifically told they are not allowed to order any. But for the most part, I think it's just mentioned as people having these drinks with their meals. And the kids obviously do not have any. Sexual content, there's none. And violence, as I said, we do have 2 people who are killed. And at some point in the story, there is someone who attacks the children. And I'll leave it at that without going into any more graphic detail or spoilery detail. All right, and then on to the NetGalley books. So like I said, I went ahead and signed up for NetGalley, and I wanted to review some shorter books just to start getting my review history going. And also, like I said, I think part of me was just kind of getting bummed out with the fact that I was not finishing very many books in June. And I just wanted something to be able to finish. And so I was gravitating towards a lot of shorter books. So the first book that I read from NetGalley was The Book of Purrs by Louis, I don't know how to say his last name.
Coelho.
Okay, I'm probably still going to butcher this pronunciation, but Coelho, I think is how they said it. It's Portuguese, so I'm not entirely certain how to pronounce that. You've probably seen his cartoons on social media. He does the cat cartoons that are drawn by pen. They are actually drawn by pen, I discovered. These are not graphic, these are not digital. He draws all of these by pen, by hand, and I think he said it tends to take him on average about 20 hours to do one picture. So a lot of work obviously goes into these, but these are just the cute cat pictures where sometimes it's a little bit of encouragement, but most of the ones that I tend to see on social media are the funnier ones where the cats are talking about they love their humans, but they like to bite them and things along that line. So this book is a collection of a bunch of those cartoons, and it's coming out October 22nd. So it'll still be a little while before it's out, unfortunately. But for the most part, this was a really cute book. I loved the panels in it. I will say, as far as the encouragement ones, yes, a lot of them are ones that I hadn't necessarily heard before, but it does feel like kind of the standard, I guess you could say, secular encouragement that we tend to get. You know, you're perfect the way you are, you're enough, and things along that line. So if you like that kind of encouragement, you'll probably enjoy this book. If not, then there might be parts of this book that you don't enjoy. The more humorous ones are the ones that I enjoyed the most, though there were a few of the encouraging ones that I enjoyed as well. As far as the content, though, there were a couple that kind of surprised me because I'm just used to what I see online. There were a couple of panels that did use the S word, and then there was also a panel that used a word that's part of a female body that rhymes with the word kitty, and I'll leave it at that. It gets literally used to rhyme with that word, which that could go under language or potentially sexual content. I don't know which one you want to put that under. Drugs and alcohol, though, there was none, and violence, like I said, there are cats that talk about they like to bite people, but actual violence on the page, there isn't any. And then the next one that I read was called Violin of Hope by Ella Schwartz, and this one is a picture book, and it tells the story of a Jewish family, I'm assuming living in Germany, during World War II. And the father is a violin player. He plays for his family. They love listening to the music. But one night, some Nazi soldiers come knocking on their door, and they take away the violin and a lot of the family's other valuable possessions. And they're just thrown in a truck and they're taken away. And the violin is silent for years until sometime later somebody else comes across it. And I'll leave it at that. I won't talk about the end of the story. Like I said, it is a picture book, so it's fairly short. But this was such a good story. You know, it's a story of this family's love, their love of their family, the love of music. It's also a story of loss and a story of hope. And it's based on actual events from World War II and from the present. So this is not based on a specific story, but it's based on the story of things like this that have happened. This one comes out November 5th. So again, unfortunately, it's going to be a while before this one's available. But I would definitely recommend this one for older kids. I thought this was a really good story. And then content-wise, language, there's none. Drug and alcohol, there's none. Sexual content, there's none. And then violence, the main thing is the soldiers breaking into the house, or barging into the house, not breaking in, and taking the family's belongings, if you want to call that violence. That might be more a theme of, it could seem scary to some kids, these people just barging into the house. Maybe not so much violence, but whichever category that would fit under best to you. And then the next book that I picked up was Penny Preaches by Amy and Rob Dixon. And this one is also a picture book. And I requested this one because it's called Penny Preaches. So I figure, okay, this is a Christian picture book. I will absolutely pick this one up and review it if I get approved, and I did. But I will say this before I go into what the book is, the actual story of the book. This one is about a very divisive topic in the church. So depending on which side of this debate you fall on will determine whether or not you want to pick this book up. So this book is basically about whether or not women can be senior pastors in a church. And I know there are some people that think yes, women can absolutely be pastors and be senior pastors. Some people think women can serve in leadership roles in the church, but not as the senior pastor. And some are more on the side of women cannot hold the title of pastor, period, whether it's senior pastor, associate pastor, etc. So if you are on the side that believes, based on what the Bible says, only men can lead the church as the senior pastor, then this is probably not a book that you are going to enjoy. If you're on the side of women can be pastors in a church and can be senior pastors, then you may enjoy this book. So in this one, Penny is a young girl. I would guess she's about 6, 7, 8 years old. And she loves going to church. She loves seeing people there. She loves singing the songs, and she loves listening to the sermons. And she wants to do sermons like her pastor does. And so she starts coming up with sermons herself. And at first, she's just preaching to her stuffed animals, but then she starts preaching to her friends. And she expects the applause that her pastor gets at church, but it doesn't happen. Her friends instead start asking questions like, girls can't be pastors, right? And so Penny becomes very disheartened. But then the next Sunday, her parents take her to another church where there is a female senior pastor. And I won't talk about the very end of the story, but that's the gist of what happens in this book. So again, if you're on the side of women can be pastors, you may really like the sounds of this book. If you're on the side of women should not be senior pastors, you very well may not. I will say there were a couple things in this book that did either kind of throw me off or bothered me a little bit. The first is the fact that her friends are like, but only boys can be pastors, right? And I don't know. It's one of those things that I'm like, I feel like even as a child, even though I'd only had male pastors in my church, if one of my friends who was a girl had been like, I want to preach a sermon to you, and started preaching to us, I don't think I would have questioned the fact that she was a girl. I have a feeling the author put it in that way because she didn't want, because it's a picture book, it's for younger kids, she probably didn't want to put older kids or adults in the book being the ones to question her. But it still just felt like a thing that I don't think younger kids would necessarily be aware of unless their parents have specifically talked to them about that. So that part seemed just a little bit odd to me. But again, it might just be because it's a picture book and she just wanted this to come from the younger kids and not adults. The other thing is that it almost seemed to have the idea of if you have a gift from God and you're not using it in the way that you want to use it, it means your gifts are being suppressed. And there was one reviewer I saw on NetGalley that I agree with, who basically said that different people can have the same gift, which the author also mentions in her book, but it doesn't mean that you're always going to use it in the way that you want to use it. If you have a gift for preaching or teaching, you might teach a Bible study class or a Sunday school class or a myriad of other things. And I mean, there are areas where I feel like God has given me gifts, but it doesn't mean I'm using them in the way that I necessarily thought I would or in a way that I wanted to. It depends on the needs of the church more than anything else. And so I'm not sure. Again, being a picture book, it's shorter, and maybe part of it is just trying to get this information condensed down and on a level that children understand. But I don't really like the idea of if you're not using your gifts the way that you are wanting to use them, that it means you're being prevented from using your gifts. So that's my personal take. And I'm not going to specifically comment on the aspect of should women be pastors or not, because, again, it's very divisive. People have different reasons for believing what they believe, and I'm not going to get into that debate. But there were just a couple other things in there that I thought should be noted. Content-wise, there's nothing. There's no language, there's no drugs and alcohol, there's no violence, there's no sexual content. So, all right, and then the last one that I read was Vincent, a Graphic Biography by Simon Elliott. And I just realized I didn't specify on Penny Preaches. Penny Preaches comes out August 13th. So that one's coming out a little sooner. And Vincent, a Graphic Biography is coming out on August 6th. And sorry if the camera moved, my battery died again, per the norm, because apparently I'm just too long-winded. This is the story of the life of Vincent van Gogh. And it's told from the perspective of his sister-in-law, his brother Theo's wife. And I will be honest, I learned a lot more about her than I ever knew from this book. There was a movie I watched about Vincent van Gogh's life. I think it's just called Vincent, but I'm not entirely certain. If I can find it or find the IMDb page for it, I will leave it linked down in the description. But I learned a lot about Vincent van Gogh's life from that one already. But there were still things that I learned about him in this book that I didn't already know. And this book pretty much chronicles his life from the time he's in his late teens until his death. But then it also covers the work that his sister-in-law did after he died to get his art out, to get it visible to the public, and to get people to appreciate his art. And it's basically because of her that we even know who Vincent van Gogh was. So overall, I thought this did a really good job of giving an overview of his life. Being a graphic novel, it's not overly detailed, but there is a lot of information in there still. However, yes, there is some content that I need to mention for this book. Language, there's none. Drug and alcohol, there are a couple of mentions of drinking, and there's at least one mention of Vincent dealing with excessive drinking. And I feel like there was one mention of him using some kind of drug, but I can't remember what it was. So, yeah, sorry. Sexual content-wise, there are a couple nude images of women in the book. They are hand-drawn images in this, and they somewhat reflect the style of Van Gogh's art, but there are still nude images there. And there's also mentions of him dating a prostitute and getting her pregnant. Then violence-wise, there is some, but unfortunately it's a bit spoilery if you don't know details about Vincent's life or his death. So I'm just going to put an image up here on the screen. And if you don't want to be spoiled, you can mute the video until I'm done going over this portion. But I do at least want to mention it for anyone who wants to know. So there is a point where Vincent cuts off his ear, and we see the knife being held to his ear, and then we see the blood. Again, hand-drawn images, but it is still there. And then we also have him shooting himself in the stomach, and we see the blood from that. There is another attempted suicide in this book as well. It's not Vincent, but there is another attempted suicide with poison. And I think that covers all of the spoilery stuff. Then themes-wise, Vincent dealt a lot with depression, so that's covered in the book. And there were bouts of mental instability and staying in an asylum, both for Vincent and for one other person that's mentioned briefly. All right, so those are all of the books that I read in the month of June. Again, a lot of short books, unfortunately not a lot of novels, but I'm hoping that changes in July. Let me know down in the comments below what your favorite book is that you read in the month of June, and also if you read any of the books that I talked about today and what you thought about them. As always, I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you later.